This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 79 of Here's How for the 27th of September 2018. Cervical check was a huge story over the last couple of months, and the possible errors they made seem to be emblematic of the dysfunction within the Irish Health Service. Let's hear what a cancer research specialist has to say.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast.
The optics were bad, and politicians used that. I remember at the time, they were like, oh, this is terrible. You can even...
hold on, are you sure that the politicians are all that much more guilty than the consultants there?
In this case, they may not have been, but you can't say all the consultants.
I would expect morally that they should be thumping the table, insisting on what's best for their patients, and that doesn't always seem to be the case.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
I was talking in the last couple of podcasts about water charges and the resistance to them, particularly in the light of the summer droughts, and there was quite a bit of feedback about those pieces. One of the main points that I was making was that water metering would discipline both the consumer and the supplier not to waste water. In podcast 75, I said this. The Irish Times reported that richer areas of Dublin, such as Dublin 6, use an average of 488 litres per person per day, while the working class people in Dublin 20 use an average of 290 litres per day. The average person in the UK is 150 litres per day, and the average use in the UK is less than 1/3 of the average use in Dublin 6. And I probably should have known better than to rely on Irish Times figures without checking them out. One listener who did check them out was Brian Green, and he pointed out that my comparison with the UK was wrong because the figures from the Irish Times were per household, not per person, as they said, and thanks to him for that. But my point that there was quite a big variation in water usage, and that these differences largely track wealth, is still valid, even if the figures are collected at the household level rather than the individual level. In Dublin, within a few kilometres of each other, you have a working class area, Dublin 20, where people use about 270 litres of water per household per day. And a few kilometres away, you have Dublin 4 and Dublin 6, where people are using 80% more, almost double. I think that Brian was on the same page as Brendan Ogle of Right to Water, who I talked to in podcast number 78. Brendan's take was that there just isn't much slack in the system. There isn't much conservation that consumers can do to moderate water use.
Irish Water itself believes that if every home in the country is metered, and we all fall in with the Irish Water Plan as it was, that they can save 6% of the water that is used domestically.
So all this inspired me to go to the source, pardon the pun, and have a look at the raw water consumption figures and to see if they told a tale. Could we work out whether there's a justification for water metering? So I went to the CSO, and special thanks to Lynn Nolan of the CSO, who dug out the information for me. And oh boy. What I got was the data from water meters for 2015 and 2016. 2017 isn't ready yet. It's divided into centiles. That's to say, grouped by each percent, the 1% who are the lowest users, the next lowest percent, and so on, all the way up to the 100th centile, the highest users. So it's quite fine-grained. One figure that screams out is that, get this, in 2015, the 100th centile accounted for more than 25% of all the domestic water use. Get that, a quarter of all the domestic water supply is used by less than 1% of households. The figures show that there is a gigantic variation between the amounts of water used by different households. Now, we have to be careful with the figures because, for sure, the bottom few centiles are almost certainly dwellings that are vacant for some or all of the year in question. The bottom centile averages only 1 litre of water per day, so there's obviously nobody living there, and if there was, they'd be dead of dehydration. Also, according to the CSO, about 13% of Irish dwellings are vacant, so if we disregard those and look in 2016 at the 20th centile, so from the 20% mark upwards, those households are using 123 litres per day, and the 50th centile, the median, is only double that. But the 99th centile, those households are using 1,500 litres per day, 10 times more than the 20th centile. And the 100th centile, the top 1% of users, are using more than 40 times more water than the 20th centile, more than 6,000 litres of water per day every day of the year. Bear in mind that these are domestic water users. They're not hotels, they're not swimming pools, although I don't see how you could possibly use that much water unless you were regularly refilling a swimming pool. That amount couldn't even be explained by massive water leaks. Your house would fall down if that much water was leaking into your foundations every day. To put that figure in context, a good-sized domestic swimming pool, the type that you get in a bog-standard house, according to some campaigners, would take 60,000 litres of water to fill. Those people in the top 1% could refill that pool every 10 days and still have plenty of water left over to make a cup of tea when they were finished their daily swim. One lesson from this is that there is a massive variation in the levels of domestic water use. But there's another lesson. I mentioned that in 2015 the top centile, the top 1%, used more than 25% of all the domestic water supply. That figure that I'm referring to, the 6,000 litres a day in 2016 for the top 1%, is only 17% of the domestic water use. Get that. The top 1% of users between 2015 and 2016 went from accounting for a quarter of all the water, 25%, down to using only 17%. What happened? I don't know for sure, but I do know that water charging kicked in 2015. And then those people saw their bills. And then the next year, they drastically reduced their consumption. Sure, the top 1% are still using enough water to drown a herd of elephants, but the reduction in their usage from 2015 to 2016 accounted for 8% of all the water used by every household in the country. I take the point made by Brendan Ogle that it might have been better to spend the metering money on other things. But the fact is, there are now 700,000 domestic water meters installed in the country, and those figures alone show that they have the capacity to make a very big dent in excessive water usage.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On the line, I have Dr. David Robert Grimes. He's a doctor of physics, he's a cancer researcher, and he's also a contributor to the Irish Times, The Guardian, and other publications. David Robert, you've been tweeting about the cervical check cancer, and I have to say that your view doesn't seem to coincide with the accepted view of this scandal. Can you maybe, just for people who are not cancer researchers, give us an idea of the background of that, of exactly what is cervical check, what went wrong, why in your view it went wrong, and what should be done?
Sure. I will clarify, I think now though, since things have matured a little bit, I think the views that I put forward from May onwards are now pretty much what came out in the Scally report.
Okay.
But I wasn't unusual in that regard because that's what most people who work in the medical or medical science sphere would have said. So essentially what happened, and I wrote about this for the Irish Times back in May, and I think the tweets followed on or preceded that. My memory is, I'm getting old. I can't remember which order I do things in. But the essential problem I felt was that there was a problem, and the problem was one of communication. So Ireland's an unusual country with regards to our cervical check program, because we, by default, give patients their audit results. I should probably explain what that means, because I think a lot of confusion pivoted on the kind of outrage headlines that we saw where women were denied their cancer diagnosis or, it was kept from them.
Well, the headline I'm looking at is, and this is in the headline, it says, "I'm dying because of human error, and that's disgusting." That's a quote attributed to Emma Vikvahuna. Is that correct as you view the situation?
It's a weird one because it pivots on two different definitions of error.
Okay.
There's a scientific error, which is a disagreement from the expected result. Every measurement you do has an error. You can't avoid that. And then there's the kind of the commonly understood verb error, which is someone messed up.
Well, human error would indicate that.
Yeah, well, but not to a scientist necessarily. But yes, to the public, I can understand that. So to go back to the beginning of this, if I should probably start at the beginning for your listeners, so that makes more sense. So firstly, there's two kinds of tests that we talk about in medicine. We talk about screening and we talk about diagnostic tests, right? The idea of a screening test, which cervical check or breast check are, is that you take asymptomatic people with no symptoms, who are just, healthy, regular Joes and Janes. You take them in and you do this kind of wide net, and you might catch markers. Now, you won't, like in this case, you don't actually catch cancer. You catch markers that might make that person more inclined to get cancer in future, or might indicate something is going on that could lead to cancer. Now, the idea with the wide net is you cast it all over the place. As long as the person has no symptoms. If they have symptoms, that's a different story.
To bring you to non-technical terminology, David Robert, if you were to say the difference between a clinical test, a diagnostic test, and a screening test was that a diagnostic test is somebody who's sick and you're trying to find out what's wrong with them. A screening test is you're trying to find out if somebody's going to get sick.
Exactly. That's a really good version. And a diagnostic test is specific. It's like, we think it's this illness. We have good reason to suspect it. We're going to do a particular test. It is to get a diagnosis. A screening test is just to catch things. And by definition of being a wide net, it'll catch a lot of potential cancers and go, oh, that's good. It'll also miss a lot. And people just go, well, why can't we just do more screening or change the screening? And it gets down to a very technical level of statistical mathematics called Bayes' theorem. But the short end of it is that you don't make things better by throwing more screening. You get into a situation called overscreening, where you start catching very healthy people and subjecting them to very invasive, very frightening tests that they don't need. So
okay,
there's always a trade-off.
Essentially what you're saying is that given that we are humans and we can't be all-knowing, there will be false positives and false negatives in that. And and when you do loads and loads of screening, you're going to get lots more false positives, which basically means you're saying to somebody, maybe you've got something when in fact they don't.
Yeah.
And that can be very distressing. But actually, at the end of the day, they're not ill. Much more serious, or at least viewed much more serious in this, is a false negative. Somebody says, yeah, you're fine, and you're not. That's, as I understand it, unavoidable. Once in a while, that's unavoidable. But one thing that I saw in this was that the US firm to which a lot of these tests were outsourced was finding something like 1/3 fewer cases that they thought required attention than was the case when that was being done in Irish labs. That does tend to indicate something is not quite right, doesn't it?
It would if that was true, and it's not. So we now have the Scally report, which actually points out the American labs were entirely congruent with the Irish labs. That claim that you refer to, I heard that emerging back in May, and it was a slightly altered version, but the 1-3 figure came out. It was the argument that, if Americans do their cervical checks yearly and we only do ours every 3 years, then surely the labs in America, won't be as attuned to that. So that point was made. But that point was wrong. Because again, America has now moved to 3 years. The American Cancer Society have come out and said, no, we should be screening every 3 years because we're getting too many false positives by screening every year. We are unnecessarily subjecting people to really invasive extra tests, and we're not saving any extra lives. It's all about what balance of this saves the most lives. And the American labs in the Scally report were congruent with the Irish labs, which is exactly what you'd expect from an accredited lab.
You're clearly an expert in this area of research. I'm trying to drag you into the popular language, and which is basically a polite way of saying I'm trying to understand what you're saying. So in that event, why then did Emma Vic-Fahuna and Vicky Phelan and other women get multi-million euro settlements? What were they being compensated for?
Now, this is where, I mean, if you get a few drinks into me, I'm sure my opinion will be stronger. But when I talked to my colleagues in gynecology and my colleagues in screening, they were very not unhappy about the settlements. No one, wishes any ill to any of the women affected. But it was a political message being sent out, a legal message that was not, on the same page as the science, because it was already creating a hierarchy of cancer sufferers. It was saying, well, if you got this, and that is a legal problem and a legal question that I wouldn't feel comfortable going into.
To clarify, what exactly is the problem?
So the real problem that happened in Ireland was never one about the tests. And that was where a lot of politicians and media outlets absolutely failed the public. The problem was about disclosure. So to get back in, I'll try to make this as low level as possible. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be disagree. So there'll always be, potential cancers missed, potential markers missed. That we know that's unavoidable, right? So when you are diagnosed with cancer, if you're a woman and you get a diagnosis of cervical cancer, we do a thing called an audit. So we go back through your previous smears. And with that hindsight, we go, is there anything in this cytology, in this mess of cells, that I might have interpreted differently, or we might have graded differently, knowing that the patient ultimately got cancer?
What's the purpose of doing that?
Quality control. Or you learn new things. Like we're constantly trying to make it better. We're like, oh yeah.
This is what the meteorologists call backcasting, that essentially saying, okay, we missed something, what should we have missed? That's for the benefit of essentially future recipients of the screening.
Absolutely. And it's also to make sure, it's also for quality assurance. So you go through and go, okay, if you went back and there was a really obvious one that was missed, then someone should go, hey, what's going on here? The idea is to keep the program consistent, and we've done quite well on that. I mean, it comes out well in the Scally report. The problem was, in Ireland, unlike anywhere else in the world, we should have full open disclosure. So if you get an audit result, like I think it's 211 women affected, if your audit result said, actually, on one of your previous smears, we could have graded that differently, knowing what we know now. Now, that's not actually an error per se. This is the weird thing about it. That is, you cannot get rid of that hindsight. For
the listeners, David Robert, essentially what's happening here is that there is an image taken, I don't know, is that with a sonograph, or what's the equipment to take that image, or a smear test, and people look very carefully just at the structure of the cells, and they try to visually interpret, is this just a normal cervical cell, or is there something here that indicates that this may become cancerous? So it's a human being looking at a slide enlarged image of a cell that may or may not be a normal cervical cell.
Well, it's not just one cell. It's usually
a group of cells, yes.
So you're trying to find patterns as well.
Yes, so a pattern that the essential thing that's happening is you have somebody looking at a screen and making a judgment call.
Absolutely. And that is, a lot of screening tests are that. For example, you might see cells looking a bit weird, but the patient has had a particular infection that you know about or something. So your interpretation is based on several factors.
Okay, so it's not just visual. There's side information
and
in
it's
there
not
as
just
well.
It's not just one medic signing off on it. It's at least two medical professionals have to agree. That's the thing.
So pause on that then, because the question is, obviously, that's a highly skilled job, and it is a matter of interpretation, and sometimes people will interpret it incorrectly, as we said, and get false positives, think that there's a problem, potentially cancerous problem, when there isn't, or more seriously get a false negative, not realize that the problem that is there, not actually notice it.
Yeah.
And some rate of that error is, shall we say, excusable or normal. You can expect those human beings just not to be able to detect that.
It's not just the human beings, though. It's also the fact that you might get a section of the cervix that was sampled that didn't have anything abnormal in it. There's loads of other factors that come in. But it's
okay. So having established that, and we understand that neither the technology nor the human beings are perfect. Is it the case that you're saying that they couldn't have been expected to do better than they did?
Absolutely not. No, you're absolutely right there. There'll be another. There's the gynecological college are doing something on this as well. But you expect a certain error rate, and depending on how you define that error rate, it can be between 5 and 70%, depending on what metric you use. So it gets really messy, and the statistics get hard because medical statistics are hard. That is true. Yeah. That's part of the issue that we've had.
Sorry, but just go back to clarify. In this case, are you saying that they performed as well as they could have been reasonably expected?
Yes, and I think the Scali report found the same thing.
Then I'm confused. You're saying that the payouts that were made to Emma Vic-Vahuna and to Vicky Phelan and to other people were essentially politically driven, that it wasn't possible to go into court and thump the lectern and say, yeah, you got cancer, but that's tough. You're not entitled to any money. We did it as well as we could have done.
Well, I think that the government failed utterly to reassure people. And by pushing forward a series of payments, and this is, again, not my area because I know a little bit about it from talking to people involved. A lot of people in the medical scientific community are really unhappy with how that was handled, both legalistically and from a political point of view, because that just furthered the impression that something was amiss. Now, there was something amiss, William. I think it's really important to get that across.
So what was amiss?
So but it wasn't a screening one, but I'll try to explain.
Sure.
So when we get these audit results and there's a disconnect, so, oh God, we should have spotted that, or maybe we could have spotted that, right? What we do is we're meant to inform people. You're supposed to go, oh, by the way, your audit result said this,
Okay, so audit result is somebody gets cancer. It hadn't been picked up in previous screenings. They go back, they've stored those images, I guess, and they go back and look at them again, and this is the quality control you measured. You mentioned this. In some cases, they say, well, in hindsight, look at that one there. We could probably have said that this warranted further investigation when we didn't say so at the time. You're saying that auditing result, even though it doesn't indicate any incompetence or any negligence on the part of the screening system, that should still be told to the patients to say, well, as it turns out, there was something that we at the time didn't think was very serious in a previous screening, but in hindsight, that does seem to have been developing from that time. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that can be it. Absolutely. And the thing is, in Ireland, we have on paper a very good system. We have this open disclosure system where that should be communicated to you automatically. Mm-hmm. Now, that is unusual as well. We're the only country in the world that has that. In Britain, you can get your audit results, but you have to request them. And in the rest of the world, they do not give them because it's internal. It's for making the system better. It's not for you. But the problem in Ireland was there was a hodgepodge of whether this was communicated to the patients or not. Sometimes it went back to their GP or their doctor who went, oh, there's no need for them to know that, which obviously is a kind of paternalistic side that was referred to in the Scali report. Sometimes they were told. Sometimes Cervical Check themselves would send letters out. Because there was no coherent, consistent system, even though this was supposed to be communicated, that's where the failing was. Patients should have been told that.
A doctor, perhaps a consultant, perhaps the GP gets a letter and says, by the way, you're the doctor for Mrs. X. We've had a look back at her records. She now has cancer. We've had a look back at her records. Here's what we found. And there were some things that could potentially have been interpreted as a red flag. We didn't see it as a red flag at the time, but we're just letting you know. And then this doctor says, this woman doesn't need to know that. He files it and he never tells her.
That had happened. Yeah, and that definitely did happen.
Can I just pause you on that for a minute? Because I take on board what you say about the bad science. And I take on board what you say about settlements potentially being politically driven, that it doesn't look well to drag or to resist a case by a dying mother of young children through the courts, and that's not a position any politician wants to be in, and they're happy to sign a taxpayer's cheque for a few million euro in order to do that, and if it gets them better publicity, all the better. But I don't have the faith that you have in the innocence of the system. And we can see in the Scally report, and particularly from some of the comments, and Scally said that some of the treatment of women, quote, bordered on misogynism. That is a shocking thing for someone to say, and I don't think he would have said that without reason. And the quotes that some women gave back and some of them are really hair-raising. One of them saying nuns don't get cervical cancer. In other words, impugning her sexual morals. Someone else saying, how will I find out more about this? You should watch the news. These are absolutely contemptuous responses.
I actually agree.
Yeah,
I do agree.
Yes, but there's one step further, David Robert, because it is not plausible that doctors such as these have contemptuous attitudes in relation to their communication with their patients, and that does not spill over into other areas of their work.
But yeah, and that might be the case, William, but these doctors that failed to communicate it were not the ones doing the screening. And that's really important.
Yes, but they are in that system. No, hold on for a second. The ones who got caught like that, surely they are a canary in a coal mine who are indicating that there are very, very serious problems in the health system when it comes to professionals' attitudes towards patients, and perhaps towards some patients in particular, not least women.
And that might be the case. I certainly wouldn't, and Ireland certainly has a long, inglorious track record of misogynistic things. But again, the fact that we are, at least on paper, the only country in the world that has full disclosure, which obviously failed in this case, is a step in the right direction. I do not think you can throw out the baby with the bathwater here and say, because some doctors, and as well we know, some people are misogynists, and doctors are people, and there are plenty of them who are horrendous human beings as well. I don't make any apologies for them. To say what we were originally talking about is how much we rely on the screening program. And I think the Scally report vindicates it entirely. And that's the thing. You're separating two things out, communication and science. There was a failure in communication that was contemptible, and there was attitude behind it that was a little bit, incredibly dismissive in some cases. But the science itself and the fear that people had was that their diagnoses were being hidden from them, things like that. That was not the case. And to keep saying that would be to perpetuate misinformation. We have enough problems with screening programs and vaccination programs being undermined by misunderstandings of the science that I'm a little bit defensive of it, because it does save lives. Overall, cervical check brought our rates. We originally had plus 4% a year increase in cervical cancer. Since the introduction, we've had -7. That is not
explain what those statistics mean for human beings.
So essentially that meant before we brought in cervical check, we were seeing an increase year on year in cervical cancers, right? About 4% every year increase. Since we've introduced it, we have going down by 7% a year.
That's essentially effective. It is saving people's lives, and I take that on board. But I have flown on many flights in my life. I'm sure you have as well. Airplanes are never dirty. Airplanes are never dirty. They're meticulously washed on the outside. I'm talking about the outside of the airplanes, because airlines know that people who fly in airplanes have really no idea how they work and are anxious about that they will work, and that if the maintenance of the outside, how clean it is, the outside of the airplane seems bad, then people will be very, very anxious that the other maintenance that is flight critical is also bad. And you can say that that's irrational, but that's the way that people feel. But not irrational is that if you were getting on the plane and saw that it was covered in mud, you're saying, hang on a second, every other airline keeps the outside of their aircraft very clean. There's a good reason for them doing that. This one isn't. I think you'd be right to worry.
But I think that's a really bad analogy for two reasons. Because if you're comparing different airlines and their airplanes. You have to compare the whole Irish airplane to the UK one, to the German one. They don't give disclosure to patients. This issue never would have come up in Germany.
In this narrow area, that's true. In this narrow area,
this is a huge area.
It's important for the people in it, but that's a very minor thing. And there's one other issue that caused headlines here, which was the HSE fighting like cats and dogs to prevent information coming out of the HSE that was eventually included in the Scally report, to the extent that when they were ordered to give the information, they PDF'd the files in order to make them unsearchable. So they essentially sent text files as images rather than as text in order to try and hobble that investigation. I don't care about any research. I don't care about any research. And by the way, and just as an aside, David, I have been doing research and doing FOI requests, which will come up in a future podcast, and I've had the same behaviour done towards me, whereby information that is clearly text-based and clearly available in a text-based format to the people who are giving out the information, that it is PDF'd in such a way as to make it unsearchable. That is a red flag if I ever saw one, surely.
Okay, I see. We're going to disagree on this, because I read the Scally report and they were very clear there was no attempt to cover up. They commended the systems for giving over the documents so quickly. That's been reported several times. So you're saying you are now, I don't know the details of the actual technical documents here, but you're alleging they were deliberately obscured. That is not in the Scally report. The exact opposite conclusion is. It seems we're talking at cross purposes, because I have actually read the Scally report.
No, hold on a second. I've got an article here with a quote from Simon Harris saying that it is absolutely pathetic, that's his words, that unsearchable documents were provided to the scoping probe. He said that this is a completely unacceptable way, and you and I know how these things work, that the scoping probe, they ask, and then they ask politely again, and then they ask slightly less politely, and when they've asked 7 or 8 times, they then ring up the minister's office and say, we can't drag this information out of them. And after that's happened a couple of times, the minister makes a statement to put pressure on them to release the documents.
Well, that didn't happen here. Remember the compliment that Scally actually put in the report, where he literally said that there was no cover-up. There was no attempt to hide information. That's a narrative you want to put out there I don't agree with.
Oh, okay. The first time on this, Health Minister Simon Harris has said that it's absolutely pathetic and not acceptable that scanned documents were sent to the cervical check scoping probe. It emerged last week that Dr. Scally, who's heading up the probe, has been provided with unsearchable and difficult to read documentation by state bodies. He subsequently did get the searchable versions.
Yes, and he got them, and he said there was a governance deficit in cervical check, but there was no cover-up. There was no intentionality behind that. I can see. You feel it's intentional. I don't know.
No, I don't know that. I don't know that it's intentional. I think David Robert. The way that I would view this is that there is an absence of an intention to comply.
And that would be, to me, deliberate. If it doesn't matter if your actions are passive and you can think that if you wish, and maybe you have more evidence than me than I don't think that was the case at all. I think when I've FOI'd, and I'm sure you have, I have as well, I'm often sent scanned documents. It's a pain. But I very rarely attribute malice to what can be explained by ignorance.
That's a good thing to live by. But I do think that when somebody appears to benefit from you not getting that information, and they provide the information in the most inconvenient way possible, that people are entitled to be suspicious about that.
And again, I'm not saying anyone has, I'm not telling people what to think on this. I'm telling you what I think, because that's all I can tell you. I can report what was in the Scally report. No, there was back in June, there was people alleging all sorts of cover-ups, and that didn't materialize when the report came out. I don't particularly care what Simon Harris said. Simon Harris is a politician. He's not a medical professional. He's
the Minister of Health, and it's not difficult to see what happened there. That
and his concern is optics. His concern is optics and always has been. That's fine. That's what politicians do. And I am cynical about that. What I'm concerned about is the health program being undermined.
On a general level, isn't there an enormous problem in the Irish health system, which is called, in technical economic terms, producer capture, which essentially means that the producers in any industry, in this case the doctors and probably mostly the consultants, have managed to use their power in the system to organize it around serving their needs, not the needs of, in this case, the patients?
Again, I don't know. I'm not there to answer that question. Again, my technical
you
expertise.
really don't know?
I would have to go and research that. I would not dare venture an opinion on something I haven't researched and double checked. And that's the thing. People have all sorts of opinions about how health services are arranged,
Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of opinion pieces go out all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and very few of them are well supported in evidence. There are problems in the health service, I'm absolutely sure, but I don't work for the health service. I am in no capacity related to the health service,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm also not an expert in the health service. So I'm not going to go and make opinions on things I don't actually know about.
Okay, I come from a management background, and I see things like, for example, very small hospitals in Clare with A&E departments that are, when they're audited by HIQA, they are told that they are dangerous for patients because the staff skill levels are not high enough, because the throughput of patients is too low to keep up the staff skill levels, and that these need to be amalgamated with other A&E departments in order that they can essentially be safely run, that patients survive. And this then gets very frequently, it's happened in places like Sligo and Clare and up and down the west coast and the Midlands of Ireland. It happens that you get a Save the Insert Local Area Hospital campaign, which seems to me to be an AstroTurf campaign run by the consultants in that hospital, who are big fish or medium-sized fish in a very small pond. And they are reluctant to lose their little fiefdoms, probably just for convenience reasons, but also possibly because they don't want to have a second person there as skilled as they are who might question their surgical skills.
Okay. Well, I can only speak from my dealing with, remember, Roscommon. I mean, I do agree with you. We do have to look at efficiency and safety.
Yeah, Roscommon Hospital was another one.
But I don't think that was
simply
an AstroTurf,
wrong,
because I knew people in Roscommon
I don't dispute that there were. No, I'm sure there were people who felt that out of pride in their local area and so forth. And saying we had Be Born in County Leitrim. They wanted to have a maternity hospital in County Leitrim, and this theme is repeated all through the small hospitals in Ireland. But you're a cancer researcher, and you will know that cancer survival rates have essentially been shooting up for the past 20 or 30 years. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why that's been happening is because you have more and more specialist teams knowing more and more about less and less. You don't have an oncologist anymore. Nobody's a cancer specialist. They're almost not even a breast cancer specialist. They're a specialist in one type of breast cancer, and you need a much larger population to generate enough cases to study that. That's true, isn't it?
I don't think so, no. I would disagree with that. I know plenty of oncologists with wide specialities. I know anyone who specializes in breast cancer usually knows everything about almost all breast cancers. I mean, even in Ireland, I can think of 3 or 4 names off the top of my head. So you're right that specialization is a thing,
yes.
But that doesn't suddenly mean, I mean, if you are an oncologist, you still have to know, even if you specialize in one particular cancer, you still have to know the fundamental mechanisms of cancer. You still have to know in your whole field. So if you do breast cancer, you have to know all about breast cancers, but you have to know lots of other cancers too. Now, you might end up getting a reputation and speciality in 1 or 2, but that doesn't mean you can jettison that information.
No, I'm not suggesting jettison, but for specialism, you by definition need a wider population base to generate enough cases in order to specialize in that.
No, that's not true at all. I mean, because you don't just use Irish data. For God's sakes, I mean, I analyze massive clinical trials. Bugger all of them have been done here. But the data is the data. You get it, you feed it in, you learn about something, you have a world population to look at. This is the parochialism that sometimes creeps into things. We're not just looking at Irish cases.
Then pause on that. Why then is the hospital in Clare being slated as dangerous to patients for A&E?
I would imagine it's because it's inappropriately staffed. It's not. You're asking me a question about something I haven't seen.
I'm asking on principle. And isn't it the case that you need to have a minimum caseload in order to justify a sufficiently specialized staff?
You'd have to have a sufficient case to justify the existence of an A&E or hospital in the first instance. Absolutely. Yeah. And I agree with you on management savings and inefficiencies. We have plenty of inefficiencies in the health service. But to go back to something you said earlier on, you might remember me saying, I don't really care about politicians and their optics. A lot of the reason that these regional hospitals are inefficient, unsafe, but continue to exist is because of the political optics behind them. When Roscommon, the whole furore about that, that played very negatively, even though from a scientific or a management point of view, amalgamating or downside or getting rid of that hospital made sense. It still played, the optics were bad, and politicians used that. I remember at the time they were like, "Oh, this is terrible." You can even
hold on. Are you sure that the politicians are all that much more guilty than the consultants there, who often play, maybe not to the forefront, but often play a very large role in those type of campaigns?
In this case, they may have been, but you can't say all the consultants for the simple fact that they don't have any.
All. But my point is that I would expect morally that they should be thumping the table, insisting on what's best for their patients. And that doesn't always seem to be the case. They seem to be much more enthusiastic about feeding this, we need a hospital in Roscommon, without any clinical evidence for its benefit.
Firstly, I don't think that was the case overall. I don't think most of the consultants I spoke to were saying, we should keep that. Maybe some of the ones working there, but you're forgetting their other incentive isn't just scientific. They're probably from the area. They probably have the same emotional connection that other people have to it. It's not a rational decision to make. A lot of politics, a lot of how we do things is not rational. It's based on an emotive appeal. Our hospital, our local thing. You're now expecting consultants, for whatever reason, in those hospitals to be immune to the emotive aspect, and they probably aren't.
Sure, that's fine. But they have the science. They are scientists in the broadest sense, and they should be standing up to that. I mean, I'm not expecting them to be superhuman or not to behave as local people. But for example, one of the greatest surgical scandals in Ireland was Michael Neary. He was consultant gynecologist in Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital in Drogheda, and he was basically butchering women and couldn't be challenged because he had such a powerful position in one small hospital. He was basically the king of the hill. If he had been in a much larger institution, he would have been caught much faster, wouldn't he?
I'm sure he would have. And I mean, we're not in disagreement about this. But the only difference here is you seem to think that this is the consultants behind this and some cabal, and I simply don't.
I don't think this is a cabal, but I think that consultants are taking it upon themselves to make sure that their lives are comfortable, perhaps to more of a degree than they are protecting their patients.
And I'm sure that can happen. But I think that happens and this is a really depressing reality, that happens in every profession. You can look at the cuts made in teaching salaries years ago when older teachers decided that they were happy to screw younger teachers with different hours. Like, it happens. People will look after themselves an awful lot of the time. And just because they have the requisite training where they shouldn't, or they should be more magnanimous or more whatever, I don't think that necessarily expecting them to be so is realistic. I think that's why you need oversight. That's why it's not like consultants can lobby and give out all they want. If they have proper oversight, it doesn't actually matter.
That oversight is much less effective. And I obviously don't want to accuse all consultants of being like Dr. Michael Neary or anything remotely like that. And I'm not suggesting that they have problems that are anything remotely like that, which was at an extremely serious level. But everybody is tempted to take an easy path every once in a while. And what I'm suggesting is that the problems and the bad organisation in the health service, which allowed Michael Neary to get away with what he did, also allow them to get away with bad behaviour.
Quite possibly. But if you're talking about ineptitude in Irish services and systems, that has been endemic forever. And I would like to see it changed and improved. But I'm not necessarily sure if consultants are a significant part of that. I think they might contribute occasionally, but I think it would be a relatively low level of influence compared to the amount of political inertia we have, to the amount of NIMBYism we have, or the opposite, like we want that in our backyard. It's the opposite of not wanting it in your backyard.
Yes.
I think all those factors, I think political optics have a much bigger thing. There's a joke about the Irish that, we get the politicians we deserve. We always say we want change. We don't want to go through the pain required for that change. And if you look at going back to consultants, I mean, I talked to a few during the beginning thing of Cervical Check, and they're much more limited than you'd think they are. I mean, a lot of them are outraged by different aspects of it, but they couldn't raise their head above the parapet because they would be in trouble. They have, whereas I could talk about it because I'm an academic and I have freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. You don't actually have that in the health service entirely. Your job could still be dependent on a lot of different factors. They're not as free, I think, as you would say they are. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more kickback when basically politically, when Cervical Check, when the thing broke about it, mm-hmm. there was an attempt to basically, imply that it was all negligence and it was all, that kind of stuff. And I think, for example, Simon Harris massively dropped the ball. And my fear, again, as a cancer researcher, I don't actually care about consultants. I mean, they do a great job, whatever. I don't care. I care about patients. And I care about anything that could have potentially undermined a life-saving intervention. Mm-hmm. And when the government, instead of, with the vaccination thing, which I was obviously, yourself, I've been quite active in, one of the major good things the government did is when we had all the anti-vaccine scares, they got behind the scientific medical establishment and they put their weight behind it and they said, well, of course we understand safety and people's concerns and we'll look into that, but we think this is a life-saving measure and we support it.
These are the politicians, you're saying?
Yes. They did the precise opposite with Cervical Check. They were all so keen to score points in it, to throw the ball around each other. And what they did, and it really worried me, and it still worries me, is that they undermined public confidence in something that was vindicated to actually be doing the job it was supposed to be doing. And that's my only concern. I don't actually care if these people get re-elected or not, or I don't even care if the consultants have to move hospital. That's not my concern. My concern is, will people die or will people live? And are we doing the right thing?
Dr. David Robert Grimes, Doctor of Physics and a cancer researcher, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks, William. Thanks for having me.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Record a contribution to be included in the next show. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references for everything we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter, and follow David Robert Grimes at DRG1985, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.here'show.ie. And finally, there's a link to my Patreon account there. So if you'd like to make a small donation to help me make the podcast more frequent with more research, I'd really appreciate that. All the details are on the website as well. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.